Hello, in this video I'm going to take a really basic pad sound like this and then we're going to try and make it more interesting and hopefully turn it into something like this. So this pad uses 6 standard VCV oscillators and it's also using the Surge Unison module in the top right corner there. And what this does is basically multiply voices onto polyphonic channels and then it detunes them and spreads them around. This pad uses a frequency shifter effect, which is actually something I discovered using guitar with VCV. And there's also a feedback path with a mixer there in the middle. And the feedback is just accentuating the effect. But if you give it a tiny amount of frequency shift, a few thousandths of a hertz, what it does is it just gives it a really slow movement and it makes a kind of slowly evolving pad sound. For oscillators, it's just using the XFX wavetable oscillator and one of the Surge VCOs, which have all got Unison mode built in, which is really useful. We'll be looking at that later on. Okay, so the next example is a phaser pad, but the phaser here is actually the filter module, the XFX filter from the Blamsoft collection. That filter's got loads of different modes, and one of the modes is a phaser mode. But because the filter's polyphonic, you're basically getting a different phaser effect on each note. So that just gives it more evolving, really. Again, more of a thicker sound. These are all using free modules, by the way. Okay, so this example actually uses 4 sample players. It's a really kind of retro 90s sound. The samples are actually from a sample cell collection, which was the library that came with a really old piece of hardware, which I owned back in the 90s. I think the samples are actually used for the Mario music, so they're quite iconic. But the vector mixer, if you can see the red dot in the middle of the screen, what that's doing, it's basically crossfading between 4 polyphonic channels. So each Sicker sampler has got a different sample loaded, and then it's kind of slowly crossfading between each one. It's fairly subtle because all the samples are quite similar, but you could obviously use completely different samples and get more of a movement in the sound, or you could also crossfade between 4 different VCOs. So the next example is a combi pad. If you remember the kind of workstation keyboards from the 1990s, romplers basically, they were just sample playback, but some patches are called combination patches, where you'd get a couple of different layers, and that's what we made here. So you've just got a basic pad, and then there's a layer of kind of modular sound effects, which are just kind of tinkling away on top. And the last example is just using sample and hold. But again, it's polyphonic, so there's a full 16 channels, and each channel has effectively got different sample and hold, giving you different filter modulation. And there's also 2 filters, so there's 2 lots of that, which just gives you a lot of random movement, kind of like a step filter. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at some of these ideas. Now, I'm not going to recreate every one of those patches individually, because that would be a really long and boring video, but I just want to look at some of the concepts that really makes this work. So the first one is obviously just stacking VCOs, combining different oscillators together. And I'll look at detuning. That's really the hard way to do it. The easy way to do it is use oscillators that have got Unison and stuff built in. So I'll look at a few of those as well. And there's also a Surge Unison module, which means you can use the kind of Unison idea on VCOs that don't have it built in. Then the next thing is polyphonic modulation. So you're really changing each voice individually when you're using polyphony. So each note in a chord basically has got a slightly different setting. And the last one is effects. So obviously you already know that you can just stick loads of reverb and delay on a pad sound, but I'll hopefully be looking at a few ideas that are slightly different. Polyphonic effects, frequency shifters, a few other bits. Okay, so let's get started. So here I've got the basic patch. Now I'm assuming you already know how to patch stuff together and make a basic pad sound. So this has really just got one VCO and one filter, which are just the default kind of the stock VCV modules. Let's turn that up slightly, and that's not massively interesting. So if you look at the MIDI to CV module, I've got polyphony set to 6, which is a reasonable amount there. By the way, the background I'm using here comes from the perforator module here. I just untick that, that'll turn it off. That's the default background, and this just makes stuff look more interesting. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is make a more interesting sound with the basic VCV modules. So if I just duplicate this VCO here, and we need a polyphonic mixer, so I'm going to use the VCA mix. I'll just move that across, and instead of going straight into the filter, I'll move that across too. I'm going to take that input into the mixer and then take the mixer output into the filter. Then I'm going to take the sawtooth wave from the second VCO. And also I need to connect the volt per octave input. I've just got an octave module here as well, so I can drop it down a bit. So you can already hear there's a slight kind of phasing. And then if you detune that very slightly, so if I hold down Control, move that a tiny bit. That's too much, obviously. You probably know this already, but we'll look at something a bit more sophisticated in a second. So how can we detune that to simulate a kind of a more analog synthesizer? So what I'm going to do here is use a module called Walk by Bog Audio, and I also want Bog Audio Polycon. You may have seen this before in the Ambient drone tutorial. So I'll basically just randomize that, and we've got 6 voices, so I want the polyphony on 6 channels. Then I'll take the output from there into the rate, so my camera's in the way, and then we can take the output of this into the FM input. So what we're going to do is leave one oscillator the same and just slightly detune the other one. So if I just play this now and increase the FM, so you can hear that sounds terrible, you actually need a tiny amount. So if we right click and do something like 0.003 maybe, see how that sounds. Okay, that's fairly subtle, maybe a bit more. So you can hear you've already got some movement there, where one oscillator is just shifting against the other one. If you think about a real analog synthesizer, obviously in the old days, analog electronics, each oscillator was a discrete component. So each one's going to be going out of tune very slightly, individually. So if you just detune the whole thing, you're not going to get the same effect. So by doing this, you're getting a different amount of modulation on each channel. So you can see out there, the signal output. So the FM's actually poly as well. So it just means that each note you play in a chord is going to be detuned slightly differently. But let's just turn that up a bit more, so we get more of the effect. Yeah, it's still a bit subtle. Let's go for a bit more. Yeah, you can really hear that now. That's obviously too much again. Knock it back down a bit. But that gives you the idea. Maybe turn the rate down a bit as well. Okay, so that's just 2 VCOs. That already sounds a lot more interesting. Another thing you can do is with the VCV VCOs, you've got different outputs for each waveform. So you can also put the square outputs into a mixer. And that's going to be similar to something like a Juno 6, where you've got a sawtooth and a square mixed together. So that already sounds a lot richer. And obviously you can also do polyphonic modulation onto the pulse width modulation. So if I just get a VCO, an LFO, and I'm going to put the output from Polycon into the volt per octave, and that will just give you a different LFO on each channel. and then take the sine input into the PWM on both those VCOs. So if I just turn the pulse width down and then turn up the pulse width modulation and see how that sounds. That's a bit fast, so I'm just going to make that slower. Still too fast. Okay, so that's quite a nice effect, and we can also do this with filters. So with the VCV filter, there's only one input for cutoff, but what you can do is just stack cables together after a recent VCV update. So we can just take this LFO and stick it into the filter. Obviously that's probably going to be a bit too much, so we'll need some sort of attenuator in there, but let's just hear it on its own. I think the cutoff's slightly too high. If we just take that down, you'll be able to. So you can hear that each voice, each note in the chord is getting a different filter mod. If I turn up the resonance, that will accentuate it a bit more as well. So if you think about it, it's more like playing a chord where you've got each note is playing a different monosynth rather than using a polysynth, because most polysynths just have one LFO for filter mod. I know there are a few available that probably do that, but I think this is fairly unique to VCV. There's maybe a few other bits of software that can do polyphonic modulation, but it's really powerful. Obviously that doesn't sound brilliant, but you can experiment with different filters, and I'll maybe look at a few others later on. So the LFO is actually moving that too much. I just stick an offset module in. And what we can do here is just turn down the scale and make the LFO modulation a bit more subtle. Let's see how that sounds. So this is all about giving a patch some movement, really. You want things just changing slowly. Okay, so that's the basic modules. Let's look at using some more interesting oscillators. I'm going to use some of the volt ones because I find they're quite good for analog style sounds. So if I find basal, and I might use a bleak as well. And what we can do, obviously there's only 4 inputs on the VCA mixer, but you can just chain those together. So if I take the mix output there and just put that into one channel, then I need to connect the volt per octave to the 2 volt modules. I'll just move that across. Okay, now let's take the outputs from the basal and bleak into the second VCA mix. And again, I'm going to give one of these some polyphonic pitch drift. So if I just take the output from this, actually that's not going to work. That's going to be way too much, so I need a second offset module. And I'll set that to a tiny amount again. And just detune one of these oscillators and just stack that into the volt per octave input. Okay, so that's sounding a bit more interesting already. If I just take down the channel that's got the other 2 VCOs, so you can just hear these on their own. Then let's get another LFO. I'll move this over here actually, running out of space. And again, I'm going to make that one polyphonic by connecting it to Polycon. And we can just start modulating the parameters on here. So let's modulate the pulse width on Bleak as well. I want that really slow, so you just get like a slow movement. And that needs more reverb. A slightly slower attack. Okay, now let's bring up the other channel, see how that sounds. Okay, so that's quite a rich sound just from 4 oscillators, just stacked together and then detuned, and hopefully that sounds a bit better than your standard pad. Okay, so that's how to detune things manually. There is a much easier way to do it, which is to use any of the Surge VCOs. So if I use the Surge Modern, for example, Modern VCO, I'll just bring this over here and connect the Volt Proctive input. Now you can see here it's got a Unison setting, so if we just listen to this, I'll stick this on another channel actually, and mute that one. Okay, so that's basically just one voice. Now if I turn up the Unison, so you can hear that's effectively doing the same thing, but it's much easier. Maybe turn that down slightly. And that goes all the way up to 9 voices. So you can hear that sounds quite rich. And again, we can modulate a few of the parameters on this using our Polyphonic LFO. So if we just select that mod and maybe change the width. And maybe the amount of pulse. And another thing I like to do next is give it some stereo spread. So I'm going to take this module here. Now if I increase this, you can hear that's just shifting each voice slightly across the stereo spectrum. Stereo field, rather. Probably don't want too much, but that's about right. It just gives you a wider image. So this is a really easy way to get thicker sounds. And obviously if we want, we can mix that in with the voice we've got already. Let's add some reverb on that channel and some delay. Now bring in our first voice. And you can hear one voice there is going through the filter and the other one isn't, so that gives you a kind of multi-layer. And yeah, you can just keep stacking these up and do as many as your computer can handle. Okay, so I've cleared that last patch. Let's just have a quick look at a few more modules that have got kind of detune or multi-oscillators built in. The first one is from Flag, and it's called Prodigal Son. I think this actually uses wavetables, but it's basically like a super saw. So if we just have a quick listen to this, let's bring this level down. Okay, I think it might need a gate trigger as well, so I'll just connect that up. I'll just solo that. I'll mute that one, sorry. Okay, so you can hear that's already quite a thick sound, and then there's a couple of parameters you can vary here. And then you've also got the rate of detune here, which is called chaos. So if I exaggerate that, you can hear that's going quite out of tune. I like the rate turned down and then make that a bit more subtle. And you can also change the amount of detune. So I find this module into a filter works quite nicely for pads. Let's use the liquid filter. This one's quite CPU heavy because it's actually analog modeled, but it does sound quite nice. So the output here is stereo, but I usually just keep things using polyphonic cables and then give it some stereo spread afterwards. So if I just get our stereo spreader again, and we'll just hook that up after the VCA. So actually I'm going to disconnect the other patch. And then we want the output from the VCA to go into the filter. And then I'll use a low pass 4 back into the stereo spreader. Let's give that some ADSR. And connect the 4 per octave input. Okay, that's really quiet. Let's turn that up. Give it some effects. Then obviously you can modulate all these as well. Let's just get an LFO. And set the speed down. In fact, I'm going to use the Bog Audio one. And this has got some great features. So it's got a built-in scale, which means you don't need a separate attenuverter. Okay, I need to slow that down again. And you can see those dots slightly changing really slowly. It's maybe slightly too slow, you can't really hear what it's doing. Let's just turn up the mix and the depth. So that sounds quite thick on its own, but it's really nice as a kind of string layer to just add on to other stuff. There's another sawtooth oscillator called Saws from Squinky Labs, which is quite similar, and you can try using this as well. So again, I'll get a VCA mixer and then take the output into there. Sounds like it's an octave higher. Let's just bring that down slightly. Okay, so both those stacked together is really thick. bring the frequency down a bit. And then let's also use our polyphonic modulation. And we can use the FM input just to vary that slightly as well. That's too fast, so let's get a second one. I didn't want that one. I'll delete that. I'm going to turn the scale up on this one. Yeah, that does not sound right at all. Okay, we got one of these set far too high. Let's just reduce all these to a kind of a sensible range. So again, you can hear each note in a chord there is getting a different filter mod, which sounds quite nice with the resonance up. Okay, so let's clear these and we'll have a quick look at the surge unison module. So if I just get a standard VCO again, then if I get the surge unison module, let's bring that across. So what we do here is you connect the volt per octave to the unison module first instead of the VCO. I might need a couple of VCOs here. I'll explain that in a second. And then you've got stereo outputs here. This actually works best with the surge ADSR module. And there's a really good video by one of the developers on the surge team. I'll stick a link to that in the description. But I'm going to use the same technique of just keeping all my signals poly, so I can route it through a poly filter as well. So if I take this output here from the VCA, nope, didn't want that one. I want the input. So yeah, that's going into the VCA mixer, and we don't need that anymore. So I'll take the output from the Unison module. Now we need to connect up the output. So if we connect the square wave, no, let's do the saw wave again. So let's connect the saw wave from 3 of these oscillators. And then need to take that out. Then these volt per octave outputs go into your tuning on the oscillators. So what this is doing is it's replacing your direct volt per octave input, and it's actually spreading it. So you can see there's a slightly different value on each channel. And the reason we're using 3 VCOs is because there's a maximum of 16 poly channels in VCV. So if, for example, you're using 8-note polyphony, and then you want 4 voice unison on each, that's obviously 24 voices, so that's not going to work. And this will actually tell you if you increase it too much, it'll say too many voices. But here, this is the amount of voices, and we can go to maybe 5 on there. Now let's see how that sounds. Okay, so that's fairly good. Level's a bit too high because obviously you've got multiple outputs. Okay, so that's another way of doing it and creating easy detuning. And there's also a drift control here, which will make things slightly out of tune. So let's just turn that up. It's quite subtle. Let's push it a bit further. So you can hear that starting to go out of tune a lot more. I like to keep things like this fairly subtle, but obviously you can make that. Yeah, you can hear it going quite far out there. So if we just put that on a subtle range, again, it just gives a slight bit of movement and gives it more of an analog feel. That's probably slightly too much. Let's increase the voice count. Yeah, still too much. So I'm going to reduce the drift and then maybe increase the detune here. And that's another way you can get the kind of super saw effect, which might be something you want to experiment with. Okay, so the last section I want to talk about really is effects, and I've got another large pad here which has got two wavetable oscillators with different wavetables and a Surge Classic VCO. They're both set to 6 voices of Unison, so that really gives you 18 voices on each note. That sounds like this. So that's already quite a rich kind of big sound, but I've also got the Surge chorus here, so if I turn that up in the mix and just hear what this sounds like. Obviously you can just go through the presets here. Like a pad is quite good. Let's turn the mix up. So this is actually running in polyphonic mode. If you right click, you've got monophonic stereo processing or polyphonic stereo. So I'm only using one input, but then I use the poly spreader to get the stereo back. So what that does is, again, like the filters and everything else, it's basically giving you a different chorus on each channel. I don't know if you can hear that, but it is subtly different to just running it in normal stereo mode. Now for reverb, obviously we've already got plateau because that's everyone's favourite reverb. Now if you want a bigger sound, you obviously can just use the Host FX module and something like Supermassive, but obviously not everyone has that module. Some people don't have a lot of money, and other people just like to make patches with free modules. Sometimes it's quite nice to have the challenge of just making stuff with free modules. So I've also got the Surge Reverb 2 here. Now if I turn the mix up on that, and you can hear that just goes absolute space pad straight away. Turn the mix down on the chorus slightly. So you can get a fairly big sound just using free modules. And there's another thing you can do as well. I'm just going to grab a filter, which is the XFX filter from Blamsoft. This filter is pretty crazy, to be honest. So if I just take the output from the liquid filter and just stick that in here. So this filter has quite a few different modes. Now if you go on to transistor ladder, you've got all these options here, various low pass. One of them is phase, which is basically a phaser effect. So if we turn the resonance up, so you can use this filter like a phaser, and again you can modulate this with a polyphonic LFO. And let's see what this sounds like. This is probably going to be too fast. Yeah, it's way too quick. Let's use a slower one, and we'll use the triangle output. Just take the resonance down, the frequency up. So again, that's giving it another slightly different dimension, but there are some other crazy modes on this. You can do things like FM as well, ring mod. This will probably sound quite bad. Yeah, it's kind of more of a special effect if you just want to make nightmare pads. I think the reverb's actually masking that slightly if we just take the mix down on the surge module. So yeah, that's another one where you can get some fairly crazy sounds, or you can use something a bit more gentle and just use that as an extra layer. What you can do as well is just split the output. So if we take the output from the liquid filter back into our VCA, then we can also take this and then just stick the Blamsoft filter on a different channel. Give that some reverb too. And what you can do is you can just have different filter types, and the two different filters will give you a different sound which you can combine together. So this is all about just adding different layers to the sound, really. Let's try the resonator. So if I just solo that, that's more of a kind of a flanger sound. It's quite thin at the top. And there's also a comb filter, which is a flangey kind of sound. So if we combine that back again, well, that's just giving you an extra layer. Doesn't seem to sweep very smoothly, that one. There's also a bit crusher, which is quite nasty. Or you can go for something more traditional, like a high pass. And that will just give you a thin layer that you can add back on. So if you just want some high end, you can add in a high pass filter and just run that in parallel. I think the phaser is probably my favourite. So there's one more thing we can do with that. If I just grab an extra LFO and turn up the rate slightly. So I'll set this back to phaser mode. And turn the resonance up. And I'm going to use the sample and hold output. Give you a kind of random step filter, which again you can just add in as a different layer. Gives a nice kind of a watery effect, like kind of droplets. So yeah, there's an example of that you can download. All the patches I've made are linked to in the description, so you can just download those for yourself and see how they work. I don't want to make this video too long, so I'm going to leave it there. But yeah, I hope you enjoy these. If you have any comments, let me know what you think. Thanks.